All right, this is our third conversation, talking about restoration, true restoration, trying to get a more accurate picture of New Testament Christianity, trying to live that picture of New Testament Christianity. We talked last time about isolation and separation, and that mostly has to do with relationships. Today, a topic that might sound similar but has some distinction is fragmentation. We're going to talk a little bit about what that is and how it's affecting us today. And I'm going to let Caleb get us started on that.
Sure thing. Thanks, Stephen. I appreciate the opportunity. And as you introduce, this is a continuation of separation. And I want to really maybe focus in on the idea of how our spirits, our minds process things in terms of separation. I'd like to first start off talking about kind of the what we're talking about with fragmentation. Obviously, the idea of fragmentation is putting into fragments, separating something as a whole. I always think of a puzzle, right? It's like, oh, there's fragments of a puzzle or puzzle pieces. They're meant to go together to constitute a whole, but we can separate them out and we can make, smaller pictures within the broader puzzle, etc. And when we think about this with the way that we conceive the world around us and understand the world, fragmentation is something that we're very good at in terms of separating ideas, separating processes, separating different concepts. And once again, going back to our previous conversation real quick, separation in and of itself is not always a bad thing. If we're distinguishing things that ought to be distinguished and separated, that's a good thing. But if we are separating things that are meant to go together, then that is a bad thing. Just like if someone came into my house and I had parts of the puzzle put together, but I kind of strewn them over different areas of the house, people would be like, why didn't you put the whole puzzle together? What are you doing with this over here and that in another room? It wouldn't make any sense. And so segmentation, separation, the idea of isolating ideas is what we're talking about. And hopefully as we kind of get into some examples, this will become a little clearer what we're talking about. And I think I've heard people talk about this with men particularly, that men are very good at compartmentalizing, right? Or having kind of like separate concepts, like you have a certain modality or mindset for work and then totally separate at home. And men, especially given their kind of proficiency for that, have been utilized for war or extremely difficult situations where you want a guy to be able to kind of close that segment of the life off and not just, be a rampaging barbarian throughout his whole life. But this has caused, as we've seen, whether it's sociological or psychological, it's caused a lot of destabilizing. And the argument, right, that we're kind of working here is that this happens not only on a societal level, but also as Christians, and it kind of affects the way that we think. I know that's all really heady. Hopefully we'll get into things, and stop me if you want to add anything or poke against it or offer any critique. What do you think?
Yeah, no, I think that gives us a starting framework. And like you just said, I think as we go on, people will see this is not just a philosophical issue or difficulty, but it's something that plays itself out in our lives if we go headlong. You mentioned already there, there's a benefit to this, in extreme situations where we have to block out certain thought processes in order to get through a moment, and that there's value to that. And I think about Paul's admonition in 1 Corinthians 16 to act like a man. It's military type language, right?
Mm-hmm.
Quit ye like men. And so that's what you would say to somebody going into war, right? Is be a man. And what that means is set down emotions. I think Leviticus chapter 10, when Moses tells Levi and his sons, do not mourn for the loss of Nadab and Abihu. Don't weep. Don't go out of the temple or the tabernacle rather. And so he tells them really he's telling them to compartmentalize, right? This thing is
Yeah.
and he says your family's going to sorrow. The whole camp will sorrow. Everybody's going to do the normal thing, but you're not. You're going to have to compartmentalize. You're going to have to fragment here for just a moment, because you've got to prioritize an approval of what God has done over the mourning of the loss of your sons. Mm-hmm. And so there's a place where there's some legitimate fragmentation that God actually commands, but that would be momentary, right? Mm-hmm. He's not saying from now on you cut yourself off from all emotion. Do not weep. Don't weep right now. Yeah. This is not the moment for that.
Yeah, and your point there in terms of talking about like context or the situation is very important, because there are times where we need to separate things out, and that's the same thing with fragmentation. There are times where we need to isolate, separate, and recognize not all the values that we can potentially have should be placed at this particular context. Same with war. We're supposed to be hospitable, even as men, right? But hospitality and war are incongruent. They can't really go together. You can't offer to like really be hospitable and then try to kill the guy at the same time. It doesn't work. And I'm not trying to get into a justification of war or anything like that, but we understand that there are certain times where you have to kind of suspend things for a while. And so there's that benefit. I think there's other benefits too for fragmentation that come in terms of the idea of focus and of depth, because it's kind of like sometimes we'll talk about the master of all trades, or what's the phrase? Sorry, I just forgot it.
Jack of all trades.
The jack of all trades. Thank you. And the master of none. And I know that phrase is longer. It's like, better is the jack of all trade than the master of none. But there's the idea of specialization that comes into play, that as you specialize, you're fragmenting off, you're separating off, and you're kind of going deeper. And even when you're thinking about scientific endeavors or fixing things, engineering, whatever the case may be, many times it's like, okay, I don't need to be thinking about all these other things. I don't need to really be thinking about, oh, well, how can I improve, my backyard? I'm working on improving this particular formula or this particular piece. I need to separate myself and give the attention that is going to be needed to adjust that. Fragmentation is very good on that. And I think that's one of the reasons why also men, particular with compartmentalization, sometimes excel at that in terms of being able to be like unplugging from everything else, focusing on this particular thing. And this was, I believe this was common also, and I know we're going to get, Lord willing, into modernism in the future, but I think this was really one of the foundational principles of modernism. And Immanuel Kant, in the 1700s, he wrote What is Enlightenment? And he argued basically for this idea, like, well, yeah, there's religion, and there's philosophy, and there's reason. And you need to be able to separate them out. They don't really go together. So you can be religious in your private life, but as a philosopher, you got to leave religion at the door. Or as a scientist, you got to, it's this separation. And that fragmentation, even today, hundreds of years later, we're still talking about faith versus reason, as if they were like opposed or different campgrounds that can never actually come into play together. And so this like division and separation of creating separate rooms or separate bins and then putting things into separate bins is basically what we have received. And it's one of those things too, where I didn't even really know I thought that way. I just thought this was the universal experience for all humanity of all time. And it wasn't really until the pandemic I started investigating some of my own thought processes and realizing, why do I hold a value system here, but in a totally different context? I'm not concerned about that value system at all. Should these things go together, or should they be separate? And if I can't explain why they should be separate, maybe I'm off. Maybe they actually need to be together. And that's when the idea of fragmentation really came to my mind. I was like, oh, my spirit is really fragmented because I'm holding certain values and negating other certain values. And I have this whole system of doing it that I haven't even really been conscious of. And so I think that is kind of handed down to us. So I don't want to just like beat anybody over the head and be like, oh, you're fragmented, shame on you. I think all of us receive that in the Western world as just kind of what's ingrained in us through education, through pop culture, through our surrounding, is that we're used to this way of thinking. But that's where we're starting to challenge. It's like, okay, well, we've already established separation. in the previous conversation is not always good and produces some really harmful things. What if that separation is actually in the way that I start perceiving the world? And that opens up some interesting questions. What do you think on that?
And that, all right. So, so in thinking about the separation that you bring up, Kant and and sort of modernist thinkers in general that want to isolate disciplines into separate categories, and you use different ways of thinking to engage in each one of those disciplines. And certainly that's the case today, right? So as you said, faith and reason, that these two things, people talk as if they don't go together. But I think even Christians fall into the same category of thought process. I think sometimes Christians think, well, yeah, but we don't do that. We think science and faith can harmonize. And I think we try to do that, but we're still guilty of some of the same sort of notions. So another way to put this is values and facts. Like, this is some of the fragmentation. This would be some of the language of the fragmentations. You got things that are values and things that are facts. Facts can be measured. They can be clearly understood. Values, that's going to be on a spectrum, right? And so your values are not really something, because they can't be measured. They can't really be brought into the public square and debated, or they can, but we can't land on any firm conclusions on values. Facts, we can land on firm conclusions. And then what people think is that facts are free of values. Yeah. But that's the problem.
That's crazy. I'm sorry. There may be people listening who actually think that, but that to me, it's a myth of objectivity, right? It is. This idea that we can take facts, put them in a bottle, extract all the values, and then be left with the real substance of things, decontextualize. That's just not how the world works. Except that, all right, from a sympathetic standpoint, what somebody does is they look at a math formula and they say, there's no value here. It just is. This just exists. 2 + 2 = 4. And that simply is a reality. And, quote, facts don't care about your feelings, right? So this is a notion that we don't like. And people will say, I don't want teachers to teach my children values. Just teach them math. Just teach them science. And the reality is that the people who developed mathematical concepts did so on the foundation of a value of God as a creator of order. And they made assumptions. The reason they arrived at those facts is they started with the assumption of the order of God's creation, and they could only build those facts on top of that, what is perceived as a value, right? And so then they build their structure up. And then what happened is, over time, of course, with the fragmentation, people said we can investigate this without thinking religiously, right? Never mind that Isaac Newton wrote more on theology than he did mathematics, but we can have this. We can have the result of Isaac Newton's theories without the reason that he was investigating those things in the first place, without the motivational value, right? And then now because we took that foundation away, we're shocked when people come along and say math is oppressive. Or math is a Western notion. And we're like, what? It's just a fact. Right. But it's not. It's not just a fact. It's a fact built on other facts and values, and that have to be in harmony in order to hold to these things. And if you say that this mathematical fact has no ultimate reality under it, then it's no longer an ultimate reality. And so, they're not wrong. They're not wrong that if you don't have this, then this is just a Western notion. Yeah. And this is very, I know for some, probably this is like jumping off in the deep end of the pool, but it's very, very important. And Stephen and I are not saying math does not exist, or that math is not objective in some sense, right? But what Stephen was mentioning, and I totally agree, it has a historical value of even the development of that. And if someone were to respond, well, yeah, maybe they discovered mathematical principles, but the mathematical principles are established by God, and it's a physical reality. Okay, cool, that's true. But why are you learning math? the fact that you are paying attention to math, and this is something that I'm very hopeful about for the future, because more and more, even people in popular science are starting to realize that consciousness, the fact that you're paying attention to something, already comes with an embedded value system and structure to it. And so the fact that you're paying attention to 2 + 2 = 4 demonstrates you've come to that point with the value. And yeah, Stephen mentioned your teachers, their teachers, Isaac Newton, all the way back to Pythagoras, right? They all had values in terms of what their assumptions are built on, and that whole concept. And so that idea of people saying, well, math is oppressive or math is Western, what they're really attacking, right, is not necessarily the facts. They don't like the values that are fused together with those facts. That there is some sense of like truth, there's some sense of objectivity whatsoever. But we have to be careful, because that objectivity, if we rip it out in a modernistic form, fragment it, and then isolate it from everything else, we get to the point where it's like, oh, objectivity in these facts can be isolated and removed from value. And that is not actually reflective of reality. And that's where I think if there are arbitrary fragmentations, they will ultimately lead to ideologies, and they will ultimately lead to idols. And I think that's what we see with modernism. It is an ideology that is built fundamentally upon separation and fragmentation. And then it's going to cause, because it's only a certain part of the whole, it's going to cause instability as it tries to broaden itself and kind of present itself as an explanatory philosophy or belief system for everything else. And just a real quick example of this too, how it's manifest in our culture. When I was teaching at Texas A&M, they were looking for new candidates for the faculty. And there was this constant tension between, well, we want to find someone who's specialized, but we don't want to find someone who's too specialized. Because if you get too specialized, then they're like nerdy. They can't talk to anybody else. They're so like obsessive with their field. And we all know engineers, sorry, engineers, but love you, but you're definitely like that. You know, many of them are. And they do wonderful jobs in terms of that point of isolation. But an integrated whole, you can't do anything. And this is where we see the tyranny of this, I think, in our present day form, whether it's in the pandemic or whether it's asking a simple question like, what is a woman? Well, I'm not a biologist. I can't speak to that, right? You know, it's like, well, who are you? What are your credentials? And what they're doing is they're saying the only way you can speak to any truth or any fact whatsoever is if you fragmented yourself off so much to the point to where you can only, you are an expert, so to speak on this. And we see this difference, as you mentioned, with Isaac Newton. He wrote about the book of Daniel. He wrote a ton about theology. He was a very well-rounded Renaissance man. So was Thomas Jefferson. So were almost all the founding fathers in the United States. But now we don't have a well-roundedness because we're like, oh, you're not an expert. Because we think knowledge has to be specialized and fragmented for it to actually be real. And in so doing, you can quote an expert, and an expert can say, well, there's no such thing as a woman, or a woman is what that person thinks that a woman is. And this sophistry that takes place that sounds like knowledge because it's so fragmented, when, you know, any average Joe could tell you that's ridiculous because they're not fragmented. They're not separated out from reality. And so I think that there are real world consequences to this fragmented form of thinking.
Yeah, just along those lines, and we're going to get more into this. I think in some of the specific things we're talking about right now, we'll get into more as we talk about materialism and as we talk about modernism, as we talk about you know, the way these secularism, you know, these are forms of fragmentation, right? Materialism and secularism are forms of fragmentation. And to the point that you're making as far as expertise, and being a form of this fragmentation. If you read about Lewis and Clark's journey, for instance, it's unbelievable the broadness of their knowledge. And in each of those areas of knowledge, I would say they had as much expertise as many people who have fragmented and made their expertise today.
Yeah.
You know, they were able to be woodsmen, hunters, They could, cook and clean an animal, cook an animal. They had medical knowledge that I think is mostly lost today. They had mathematical ability to chart their location using pencil and paper, just the instruments of the day, and all of that knowledge just contained within their minds. And we struggle with any degree of broadness of knowledge. But coming back to this idea of fragmentation, maybe in a couple of, I think, practical ways for Christians. One is, you mentioned earlier about puzzles. Bob Waldron always used the illustration in our Bible classes. He said, this is how we teach. It's like we've got a puzzle. We take a puzzle piece out of the box, and then we talk about what colors are on the puzzle piece. And we say, now here's an object right here on this puzzle piece. And what can we say about that? And we just describe that thing to the nth degree. And then we just set it down and we pick up another piece. Yeah. And then we talk about that one for another 30 minutes. Yep. And he said, at no point are we saying, what are we putting together here? You know what?
That's right.
And that's the way a lot of Revelation classes go, for instance, because there's so many bright things on each little piece. But the most important element is, what's the whole picture? And you can't understand any of those pieces well outside of the context of the whole. And that's not just true of Revelation, of course. I think it's especially true in a book like Revelation. But of course, it's true of the whole Bible. Absolutely. And this fragmentation affects the way that we approach. So I was talking to somebody the other day. We get into Bible verse wars. I've got my Bible verse and you've got your Bible verse, but at no point are we asking, how is my usage of this consistent? And this is how we determine sort of, right, how to interpret one verse from another, is how does this fit into the whole narrative? And if we don't have that, then we're both just, fragmenting and taking contextless phrases and pitting them against each other.
Yeah. Amen. And that's one thing, when I started preaching in Texas, in North Dallas, I started realizing that people could quote, Galatians 3:27. But if I said, hey, what's the book of Galatians about? People who've been in the church for 40 years couldn't tell me what the book of Galatians was about. But if I said, well, what's Star Wars Empire Strikes Back about? Oh, let me tell you, Darth Vader goes to Hoth and blah, blah, blah. They could tell you the synopsis in a couple sentences. And yet we've lost any sense of comprehension. And I think that is one of many, many areas of fragmentation. And it's because it's kind of a way of thinking. It's very hard to kind of fight against it, because what fragmentation becomes is just a normality. Like, oh, that's just how we are, and that's just how things are. And so when somebody tries to push against this concept of fragmenting things out, oftentimes we resist, not because we have really great arguments against it, or because we're being contextual or even consistent maybe with our more independent value, or more immediate values, but it's odd. It's uncomfortable. It's like doing an exercise we've never done before, or going to the gym if we've never gone to the gym. It's like it's going to work muscles that have not been worked. And we got to be careful, I think, about our reaction to some of this, because it is going to seem foreign when we start putting these things together. And just the idea with context, real quick, talking about the fragmentation, all those brethren that I met in North Texas, and even here in Puerto Rico, it's not unique to Texas, that when I say, okay, what's Galatians 3:27, they can tell me, I will ask them, is context important? Oh yeah. The Baptists, they don't pay attention to context. It's like, okay, cool. What's Galatians about? Crickets. And it's like, whoa, that in of itself is a fragmentation, guys, because you're talking about the importance of context. And I agree, context is important, but you're talking about still in terms of a particular verse. You're not integrating the whole on it, as you mentioned, with Revelation, or the entire Bible, really, on all of that. And so there's multiple levels to where fragmentation can occur. And so just because you think, oh, well, I don't have fragmentation, in that area, I see the foolishness there, doesn't mean that you're free from it on maybe, even in the same realm or area, but just on different levels. I don't know if that makes sense or not, but
yeah. And then I think too, there's the fragmentation. I mean, so there's that's sort of fragmentation of interpretation, we might say. There's the fragmentation of the various areas of our life. So, you know, I've got church life. I'll tell you, one of the things that's striking to me is when we talk about establishing authority. If you just go read read transcripts, read lessons, and read books about that brethren write about authority, it is almost all aimed at authority for corporate action, and almost none for individual action. Now, they will make the statement that there's a distinction, there's a separation, and I agree that there's a separation between corporate action and individual action, and there are different. There are just like under the old law that there were distinctions between Israel acting as a whole camp and someone acting as an individual. So I agree with that, but I don't think. You know, the passages that we appeal to about authority are by and large actually talking about individual relationships with God, right? So John 5:29, Jesus saying, I don't do anything as an individual. I don't do anything unless I see the Father doing it, right? So he's appealing. That's a great passage to use in the concept of authority, but then we immediately apply it at a corporate level, or whatever you do in word or deed. This is in the context of individual action. And so we don't just, you know, immediately throw it into the corporate, and we need to be thinking that way. And I've preached lessons about that, about having the same mindset about the establishment of authority in our individual daily activities. But usually what we do in our daily activities is we make the same arguments that we would never accept in a corporate model. So God doesn't say it's wrong.
Yes.
Well, hey, well, then are we going to port that over here? Well, no. That's a different rule. Well, what are you saying? Are we using different passages?
Yep. Two things on that real quick. Number one, and I'd written this down kind of in preparation for this, is that what I see as the public-private split, it's a fragmentation there. As you're mentioning, it's like we have church, corporate worship, and then, you know, our private lives. And I've had the blessing of, you know, worshiping with churches and working with churches in Florida, Alabama, Arkansas, Texas, Missouri, Kansas, you know, a lot of different places. And it's been quite a blessing. But every single place that I've gone in the U.S. and also many places in Latin America as well, I will inevitably hear a brother say, well, the Bible gives us everything we need, but it doesn't give us everything we need for our personal lives, or something of that sort. You know, like, well, the Bible directs our corporate worship, but it doesn't give us all the details or everything we need for living. And I'm just like, what? Like, that didn't come from the Bible. Like that's the opposite, really. Like, there's way more about our personal lives than there is about the corporate. Not saying that there's no guidance on the corporate worship, all that kind of stuff. I'm down with the restoration principle on the corporate worship. But there's that concept of, oh, well, there's the spiritual worship service, and then there's my life. And that same point of fragmentation, of fracturing this public-private, is also in a whole host of debates. It's present in the authority of elders, which when I was in Texas, I talked with a lot of brethren about this, and they'd say, well, you know, and like good Texans, they're like, you know, come and take it. My personal vote, no elder is going to tell me what I need to be doing in terms of my house. And I'm like, that's not what the New Testament says. The New Testament doesn't say like, oh, you know, the authority of Christ and the authority of elders and the wisdom of the church just goes up to your doorstep and stops, and then your personal private rights, you know, take over. There's a clear
Fourth Amendment. Fourth Amendment in church.
Well, I missed that in the New Testament apparently, but that concept is very much there, and people have this idea. And the other thing I was going to mention, the second thing I was going to mention about the danger of where this process oriented. And that's another thing that fragmentation will sometimes do, is what we'll do is we'll separate something, or we'll get a problem. We'll build a process to solve this particular problem, and then we're faithful to the process no matter what. And it's like, we got to ride this process all the way because the process is true. Well, how do you know the process is true? Well, because it solved this problem that we have. Okay, very good. But it creates all these other problems. Well, we're ignoring those other problems. We don't care about them because it solved this one major problem. And where I'm going with this is like, in terms of the individual collective split that you mentioned, and hopefully we'll be able to unpack more of this at a different conversation. But I'm not denying that there's individual and collective, just like you talked about. But because we spent so much time on the hermeneutic of the collective as a process of combating instrumental music, combating institutionalism, etc., that we didn't really pay any attention to the individual side of it. And here's what happened. When I was down at a college in Florida, right, there was a professor there, and he caused quite a bit of stir among the students because he said the biblical hermeneutic only guides our corporate worship together. And as individuals, we have full liberty to worship God however we please. And so someone asked him, he said, would it be okay if I set up a prayer shrine to Mary in my closet? And he said, I can't say that's wrong. Yeah. And there were a whole host of things. This became the mode of operation in Florida, where it's like, well, corporate, yes, controlled by God's word. Private, well, we don't have a hermeneutic for it. We don't, because our process doesn't really allow for it. We don't really think about the integration of the private with the corporate at all. We've separated these things, so we don't really have anything to do with it. It's liberty. So if someone wants to set up a prayer shrine to Mary, yeah, it's not forbidden. And just like you said, they would never, ever in a million years, and I know this professor, I love him, he would never say, oh, yes, we should do that in the church services. Right. What he's done is he has been so faithful to this process that says, well, the hermeneutic is there, and on the individual level, I can't give positive authority necessarily, and the law of exception and all this kind of exclusion and all this kind of stuff, that I have to give the possibility of saying prayer shrines to Mary in my closet as an individual is a-okay. And I'm thinking, where have we gone wrong? Like that is, to me, fragmentation to it's just a perfect example of it. And before anybody thinks like, oh, well, he's a radical down at this very liberal college, yada, yada, yada. No, in all the states I've lived in all the churches I've attended, there have been brethren who've made the same class of argument. So it's not unique to him. I don't want to pick.
And even if they don't fully verbalize the argument, the implication is there that we don't have to have authority for everything, you know, when it comes to, and I've heard brethren say that way, right? If I say, hey, where's our authority for, you know, getting together and playing board games together? Mm-hmm. And I'm not, now hear me out. I don't mean we don't have authority for that. But my point is, I don't think we think about whether we have authority for that, right? And so when I asked that question, then the response, well, we don't have to have authority for everything. That's the argument everybody's making in the religious world about corporate worship. We don't have to have authority for everything. John Piper in a podcast, somebody asked him about instrumental music, and he says, virtually no one does only what God tells them to do. That was his response.
Yep, and that's fragmentation right there. Yeah. That's 100%.
But are you familiar with Cornelius Van Til? I'm sure you are. Mm-hmm. You're not? Okay. So he's kind of the father of presuppositionalist apologetics. Mm-hmm. And so
you want to quickly define what presuppositional apologetics is?
Quickly. So the idea, this is converse to the notion that we have to start with nothing. What Cornelius Van Til says, that's not possible. You can't start with nothing. We all have to start with some presuppositions to have anything in existence. And so we just need
a value package or programming.
Yeah, we just need to recognize that. Here's my presuppositions. What are your presuppositions? And then we can work from there. But one of the things that he said was the Bible is authoritative on everything of which it speaks. Moreover, it speaks of everything. And I really like that, right?
Yeah, that's great.
That it covers all. And we'll get more into that. I'll bring that quote back up when we talk about secularism, because I think that's part of the problem. But yeah, it's the whole view. But one more thing, and we're running out of time, but I just want to, while we're talking about fragmentation,
sure.
We talked about the home last week. and isolation, separation. I think fragmentation has a lot to do with that. Again, I've got my work life, my home life, my church life, my hobby life, you know, everything's fragmented and separated, and my friend groups are separated, right? My associate, my work crowd, my hobby crowd, my family crowd. And this is modern. Life, including work and play and all of it, was together. And that was both true of the home and an individual unit, or in the broader community. But now we have so many communities, right? And they're all separate, and they're lines dividing them. And today I hear a lot of guys say, you got to have a work home life balance, and you got to leave your work at work and leave your home at home. And this is not healthy. I believe it's not healthy for the mind.
Have you heard of the concept of work wives?
No, oh, yeah.
That basically you have a separate family at work, and that goes back to what we were talking about also with the idea of turning the job into a family, because the only way that works is based upon fragmentation. And fragmentation is destabilizing. And hopefully in the future we'll talk about economics as well, both as the law of the home, right, but also in terms of various systems. And I think there's a lot of fragmentation that's there, and there's a lot of instability that we see because it's all predicated on fragmenting. And the industrialized movement is built on fragmentation. Optimization comes through fragmentation. You're not building a car by yourself. You're building a piece, and then the piece is fragmented, separated by, and then put it all together. And that's the same kind of concepts that we have. And there's many philosophers in the 1800s, 1900s talked about the idea of alienation. And with alienation, they're talking about this effect, what I believe is the effect of fragmentation. You are separated from it. And when you're separated from it, there is a lack of connection. There's a lack of ontology, a lack of purpose, telos, and it just cascades. It goes down. And you mentioned the home. We've mentioned church. For me, one of the scariest, and I would argue one of the most fundamental that I see present among brethren, is fragmentation when it comes to Jesus, the character of Jesus. It's like everyone wants to line up on one side or the other. Is Jesus this merciful shepherd that's just going to wrap you in his arms? Or is he the coming king? Is he the king yet, and the coming judge of all the world? And it's very hard. I understand. It's very hard to be holistic and to bring things in.
Is he the lion or the lamb?
Yeah, and he's both. And this is, and there's so much controversies that occur among our brethren that I step back, and I'm not trying to say that I'm above the controversy, not at all. But I look at it and I'm like, I think you guys are just talking past each other, because you've chosen your fragmented camp, and you're like, it has to be this. Jesus has to be the lamb. It's like, no, Jesus has to be the lion. And instead of providing a unified whole in a holistic say, I know from our carnal reasoning, these things don't seem to go together, but maybe through the Spirit, there is something greater beyond us that we need to accept by faith, that these things go together and work to maintain both of these. And I think of Romans 11:22, like, behold the goodness and severity of the Lord. Like, you have to hold both of them in. And if you don't, you end up serving a Jesus who really isn't Jesus. You end up serving an idol of Jesus rather than the creator himself. And that's very scary. And I think fragmentation from our modernistic system, from the way we then go and apply things in our lives and seek to justify ourselves in that fragmentation, can really even skew our perspective of
well,
God.
And you haven't even mentioned maybe one of the great fragmentations of historical theology, and that is the God of the Old Testament versus the God of the New Testament.
Yeah.
What a terrible fragmentation that is.
Yep.
And it almost allows us to set aside hard truths in the Old Testament by just saying, well, that's the Old Testament.
Yeah.
So
and the list can go on. Whether we're talking about sovereignty and free will, or faith and works, you can just go down the list. And at just about every single major controversy among Christendom, so to speak, you can see that there is a problem of fragmentation. And one of the great projects that I think that the Restoration movement leaders did in the 17 and 1800s was that I think that they started pushing against some of that. Now, obviously, Did they fully accomplish it as maybe they should have? No, but no particular movement is perfect. But that's where Stephen has talked about various times of like true restoration. It's that if we have done restoration, but we've done restoration in a fragmented sense, we're not really fully doing restoration. And that's where we've got to be careful not to just become siloed and kind of check off a box and say, oh, we've accomplished it because we put these limited parameters on it, whether it's the corporate worship versus private life or fill in the blank. We have to resist those forms of fragmentation when things should go together.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, to the fragmentation point, what you can end up doing is restoring. You can partially restore it, and if you fragment it, it can feel like you've restored the whole thing.
Yeah, like putting together, going back to the puzzle to, I guess, put a bookend on this, is like if, my sons love to do puzzles with the grandparents. And if one of my sons is working on, and they always divide up the puzzle, like, oh, this quadrant, this quadrant, this quadrant. And if one of them finishes the quadrant, he can be very satisfied, but it's not going to be the full picture at all. You have to get the whole thing together. And I think there's probably some apt analogies in our thoughts in terms of that analogy, but yeah, good stuff.
Well, all right. Well, I hope, like I say, I hope these conversations, if people are watching them, are helpful, and that we're moving from just the descriptive, kind of philosophy here down into here's how this is playing out in our lives and causing problems. Right. This is not just a philosophical shift in the way we view things, but right down to everyday normal life, that it's causing difficulties in our families. It's causing difficulties in our churches, and ultimately it's causing us to have distance between where we are and where God has called his people to be. And that's the ultimate, like, okay, I want to be there, wherever that is. I want to be there. And I mean, going back to the point of Jesus as the ultimate example, when he says, I don't do anything but what my Father tells me to do, that's for all of life. Mm-hmm. That's his whole life, right? He doesn't have a fragmented, well, I'm going to make sure I'm going to do that in this part of my life, right? His whole life. We were studying Ecclesiastes 12, and of course, last night with some young men, and obviously this is the whole of man. Mm-hmm. This is your whole existence, right? You talk about anti-fragmentation, right? Just everything needs to come into this umbrella and fall into this category. And
be consistent with it. And preachers are not immune to this. And because I've heard several preachers get up and make that point. We need to make all of our life given to Jesus. And the congregation says, amen. But then when they go and talk to people individually, those same preachers will say things like, well, the Bible doesn't give us all the answers for, how we live our daily lives. So, we just need to kind of use our own judgment on X, Y, Z. Mm-hmm. And then have a multiplicity or plurality of different views that then end up contradictory. And preachers will sometimes be their own worst enemy because they'll preach out of one corner of their mouth. Yes, the whole needs to be integrated, all given to Jesus. And then, but their personal exhortations or wisdom that they're giving to people runs contrary to that. And then they're like, I wonder why the church isn't stronger. I wonder why people aren't more faithful. I wonder why, et cetera, all these problems. And it's like, well, you're building on two different foundations. It's like you put half your house on the rock and half your house on the sand. And then it's like, well, the house is splitting apart. What's going on here? And it's like, well, I think Jesus talked about that.
Well, and we in a corporate place, we harp on here. You need to be here. You need to be a part. You need to be worshiping God. And then somebody brings up Deuteronomy 6. When you rise up, when you lie down, when you walk by the wayside, nobody's saying you got to do that. Sounds like you got to do that. Yeah. So anyway, we'll talk more about that. Like I said, secularism, we'll get into that a lot, but we'll look forward to the next conversation, and appreciate everybody who is listening, people who are benefiting, and appreciate having the conversation with you, Caleb.
Amen. Likewise, brother.